Tim Bornholdt will be our host. And this conversation is going to be about how they're using podcasting as a tool for lead generation, to grow their business, and how do they prepare for interviews. Tim Bornholdt is the co-founder and partner at the Mahonis Group. He works with businesses that need technical expertise in improving business process, increasing bottom line through automation, and custom mobile software development. He still dabbles in Ruby on the Rails and Swift UI, but his main focus is on strategy, architecture, and the user experience. So welcome, Tim.
Appreciate it. Good morning, everybody. This is super exciting. When we, Jenny, who does marketing with us, and I, we were kind of putting this together, and we thought, if we ask 10 people in the Twin Cities that we really respect, that have really awesome podcasts, maybe we can get a couple of them to join on. And I think within an hour of sending the email, we got 10 yeses. So that kind of put us in a fun spot of like, oh, good, we get to split this into 2 panels. So this is going to be really exciting. I'm really honored that you guys all decided to join us here today. So like mentioned before, my name's Tim Bornholdt. I am a partner at the Mahonis Group. I'm also a podcaster. I have a show called Constant Variables, and it's a podcast where we take a non-technical look at all things digital. So we try to break down complex technical topics into something a little more simple that everyone can understand, because technology should be approachable, right? It's no smoke and mirrors. It's everybody can get in and do this thing. What I want to do to get things started is to just have each of our guests introduce themselves, what show you host, and what you do for a job outside of podcasting. And then we'll kind of take it away from there. So Justin, why don't you start?
Sure. Thanks, Tim. I appreciate being here and appreciate being on the panel here with all these excellent fellow podcasters. My name's Justin Grammens. My podcast is called Conversations on Applied Artificial Intelligence, or Conversations on Applied AI. I really try and focus on having decent conversations with people that are really involved in artificial intelligence and part of the artificial intelligence community. I am the founder and CEO at a company called Lab 651, and we focus on Internet of Things solutions. And I also have a number of different other ventures as well that I am involved with in the Twin Cities. And I also teach at the University of St. Thomas, a course on Internet of Things.
My name is Mike Jackson. My podcast is BTT Discussions, and we talk to high-level black technologists that work at major corporations, and we talk about diversity and inclusion and just ways to kind of solve those problems, black employee retention and things of that nature. BTT Discussions belongs to our bigger company, Black Tech Talent, and our goal is to increase the representation of black technologists in both corporate careers and entrepreneurship.
My name is Christy Peel. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel. I am the founder and CEO of Minefield, a public relations agency in Minneapolis with clients all over the country. And my podcast is Flip Your Script.
And I'm Anna Bliss. I am co-host with Jess Meyer, who you'll be seeing in the second half of Women in Tech Twin Cities. And we have a podcast that's really focusing on especially gender equity, but looking cross-sectionally across equity in the Twin Cities, in the tech community, trying to raise up stories. And by day, I work at Best Buy as a senior product manager.
Hi, I'm Kaplan, and what a surprise that a bunch of podcast hosts were willing to talk about podcasts, right, Tim? I'm the host of By All Means podcast. It's a Twin Cities business podcast. I'm the editor-in-chief of Twin Cities Business Magazine. By All Means is our podcast, and we tell stories of entrepreneurship, innovation, and leadership, the people behind well-known brands and up-and-coming brands based in Minnesota.
So there's 5 really, really smart people up here with lots of knowledge, lots of time behind the microphone. This is probably different for us because usually we're staring into the abyss, and our feedback is in those 5-star ratings, right, on Apple Podcasts, rate and review. But since we're all here in person, it'd be really nice if you had questions. We want this to be a very relaxed and flowing environment. So please, I'm going to ask a couple of questions of each of our panelists, and then if you have questions towards the end, we'll try to leave some time so we can make sure we get those questions answered. But I'm going to kick things off first with Justin. So, Justin, your podcast is relatively young compared to the rest of the hosts up here. It's only about a year old. Why did you decide to start a show for your business, and what kind of return are you seeing on the time that you're putting into making this podcast?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tim. Actually, the podcast wasn't really started out of trying to return an investment on the business. It was actually more of a personal thing that I actually find interest in. And I guess what I would encourage is if you're going to start a podcast, focus on something that you personally want to do, because it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of effort. You're going to be expelling a lot of energy for potential long-term gain. And you might not see it for a month, 6 months, 6 years, quite frankly, with regards to all the work that you're putting into these episodes. So it was really done more out of a passion that I have about learning new technology and getting involved with the artificial intelligence community. And I would say, the business aside, it was more of a personal brand builder. I personally have started many, many companies, and the company has its brand, but I actually think that people have their own personal brand. And I actually think you should be thinking more about that. How can you build your brand, your awareness? And podcasting is beautiful in that it's a source of knowledge. You become the hub in this network of all these people. And with a lot of effort, but also the chance for a lot of gain, you can be in the middle of all these conversations. And there's great information and knowledge to be gained out there just by raising your hand and saying, "Can I interview you?" And so I guess when it comes to actually return on investment, I can't point to a dollar amount. I can't say, because I talked to this person or this person, now all of a sudden my business has gained this. But what I can say is I have gained a lot in my head, and I know that as I start my next venture, the next business, as I look to the next 6 months, you're planting seeds. You're planting seeds with all of this stuff, and some of them are going to grow and some of them are going to die. But I think bringing it back to the beginning is have the right passion, have the right reason, the right motivation to go out and do this. And that's why this podcast is not called the Lab 651 podcast or whatever. It's really around the technology and around something that I'm passionate in, and then I can bring together the conversation there.
Yeah, podcasting is definitely a good way to share knowledge. Allie, one question for you. You interview a lot of prominent business leaders, like all over the Twin Cities. It's frankly intimidating because I feel like you get all these really big name people that really you get them to open up and share stories. I think, a lot of times those individuals specifically, they get pretty well coached when they go on to a show like yours. And I think they kind of know what they're going to say. So I'm really curious, like when you bring on a guest, how do you find ways to trigger something of substance out of them so that they are able to share knowledge without feeling like they've been overly coached?
I don't allow publicists in the studio or anywhere on the line. Now that we sometimes do it virtually, they're like, "Can we join the Zoom?" And I say, "No, you cannot." No, that's number one. I think what I've always found as a longtime journalist and reporter is that it's a publicist's job to be very careful and set the parameters. Usually when you get the CEO or the founder on the line, they're pretty forthcoming, and the publicist is kind of there to keep in check. So, I say from the start, this is not your typical interview where we're looking for sound bites. We're talking. We're having a conversation. You've got to be willing to tell stories. You've got to be willing to talk about your whole life story and how you got here. I don't just want to know, your earnings report for the last quarter or something like that. And some people are not cut out for that. I always say there are people who are great, great experts to talk to, but maybe they're not a great podcast guest. All due respect, and it takes a certain type of story and a certain type of person to make it a really good and engaging episode, and that's kind of what we look for. There are times where we'll have a publicist say, "You know what, we can't talk about this or this," and we'll work through it and be respectful. But for the most part, I find that once you get that person going and comfortable and in a studio and no one else around, they just talk.
On that note, how do you get people, if you do get in a situation where someone's not comfortable or it's kind of, you feel like it's just an awkward podcast, how do you recover from that? How do you do you have any tricks or anything you go to try to maybe make them pivot some way or get them excited to be there again?
It might sound overly obvious, but humor. I'll ask questions that might seem, kind of light. I'm happy to make myself sound really dumb and be like, could you just break this down for me? I really don't understand neuroscience. But, it'll be like, my God, how do just things that seem really basic, and you get them to laugh. And once people are laughing and it feels more human, I do mix in, we start out generally talking about childhood and personal stuff, and that kind of loosens people up a little bit, so I find that helps a lot. We've done, I think we're approaching 80 episodes of By All Means. I have had one that we weren't able to air because the person just couldn't do it. I kept trying, and it was like pulling teeth, and they just couldn't get off their like very, robotic sound bites. And it didn't work for the purposes of our show. But other than that, it's kind of magical.
1 out of 80 is not bad.
Right.
Anna, you host the Twin Cities Women in Tech podcast, and it's kind of unique being on the sales track, especially because you're not necessarily selling a product, you're selling more of a vision and an idea, which is the idea of inclusivity in tech. How do you go about measuring what success looks like for the podcast?
We measure it a couple of different ways. I mean, there's the obvious ways of how many people are actually listening. But honestly, the best way that we've found is when we're out at events like this, when we're at Mini-Star events, which is another great place to go, people will come up to us and say, hey, I heard your podcast. Or, I'll walk even through the halls at work and somebody said, I just found out you have a podcast and you were talking about this and you talked to this person and it made me think. And that's really the best part for us, for Jess and I, is when somebody says to us, it made me think, or I've really thought more about how we look at equity, how we look at inclusion, where intersectionality comes into something, or how I think about how I'm going to approach my own career. That's really the key to success for us. I mean, if we've got 10 people that listen to us, that means that it's more than my mom and my big brother. And Jess's husband, and but if if we're getting good downloads, that's one thing, but it's really that ability to cause people to pause and think about not only what they're hearing, but how they can then affect what's immediately happening around them. To really think about, how do I use language differently? How do I think about inclusion differently? How do I think about how I'm running the meeting? How do I think about how I'm hiring? How do I think about how I'm funding my next startup?
Yeah, it is interesting when you're out in public or when you're at events like these and people are like, I listened to your podcast, and you're like, really? Yeah.
Well, and not only that, how do you know who I am?
Right.
Because we're not on video on ours. It's all audio. So how do you recognize my voice in the crowd to know who I am? Unless you've looked me up on LinkedIn, you're not going to know who I am. But when that does happen, you're like, oh, you're listening to me? Wow, that's kind of cool.
Yeah.
I didn't know I had that impact. Cool.
Yeah, I think that's a really great way to measure success in podcasting, because you can make money if you are Joe Rogan or somebody else that's getting millions and millions of listeners. But for most of us, we're not getting millions and millions of listeners. We're lucky to get a few hundred per episode, and that's in and of itself, like something like Justin was alluding to, when you pick a topic that you're passionate about and you can share that with the world, that's the success in and of itself. And then having people come up to you in the meantime is bonus.
Yeah, and we actually had one guest who reached out to us who said, I heard this other guest because it's somebody that I know, and I have this thing that I also want to talk about, and can I be forward and be on your show? And we said, yes, absolutely, because we think you have a good story to tell, and there's more that you can add to the conversation. And that was, in its own way too, kind of, that was kind of neat to have somebody say, I think you have a good show, and I think what you're saying is good, and I want to be part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Mike, Black Tech Talent recently celebrated its 1-year anniversary, so congratulations.
Thank you.
Looking back over the last year of growth, I believe you mentioned at one point that doing the podcast was probably the highlight. Not the highlight, but one of the most favorite things of working with Black Tech Talent. So what is the podcast like? What is the effect of that show and the impact been on your business?
Yeah, so for us, when we created the podcast, we looked at 2 different audiences, right? We looked at the Black community that was aspiring to get into tech or is kind of at that entry level and wants to see how to level up. And then we looked at diversity and inclusion officers, HR, IT recruitment. So on one side, we educate in that field and are able to have conversations that they'll never hear, right? So it gives them that ability to be that fly on the wall and hear the complaints and hear the journeys and things like that Black people that are already operating at a successful level still go through today. So we've talked about natural hair in the workplace. We've talked about colorism. We've talked about the difference between the African experience and the African American experience. We've talked about the way we dress and things of this nature. And so these are candid conversations that now these companies, if they care about actually being inclusive, can take consideration of. On the flip side, with the community, we've had people reach out and say, oh my God, I didn't know this many people are operating at these high levels, and can you introduce me to such and such so I can ask them if they'd be willing to be a mentor or to be a guest on our podcast or to be featured in a magazine or a newsletter. So the impact is, it's allowed us to put out a ton of content, which is important, and we primarily distribute outside of the normal streaming services on LinkedIn for our social media. And so it's allowed us to create a ton of content that's valuable, and it's allowed us to kind of bring those two groups together on one platform and product that then allows us to open up that conversation.
Yeah, the more I look into DEI initiatives, it is just crazy how important representation is. And having a platform where you can help share people's stories and have people reach back out to you and say, hey, can you introduce me to so-and-so? Or, who should I talk to in this space? Like Justin had said, you kind of are like the center of a hub of sorts where you can kind of start making those connections, and what better way to make an impact like you're trying to make.
Definitely, and it allows the audience to reach out to each other and to have conversations in the comment section. And as we grow as a company, and me being the founder and CEO, the less that I'm available necessarily to speak one-on-one, there's still that platform where we can continue those conversations as I put these things out. So it allows us to still have that personal touch even as we scale.
I love it. Kristi, bring you into the fold. So, your show, as the name implies, you interview people who flipped the script on their life, which often leads, to starting a business or doing something entrepreneurial. But I would imagine that a lot of times it brings up difficult moments. And I'm really curious to hear how you're able to do, through a podcast, get people to kind of open up about times in their life that might not be, as heroic or, as much as you would want to be the hero of your story. How do you get people to open up like that?
It's all about story, and people love sharing stories, and science shows that people connect with story. And one of the fascinating things that has happened with the Flip Your Script podcast is because of the pandemic. It was launched in 2020, so we started recording in March 2020, April 2020. We were able to secure guests who typically are traveling. So I was a little bit shocked at the yeses that we were getting, and people were hungry to tell their stories. So next week's episode features the former IHOP CEO, and she now has launched a new business. She's thrilled to share all of the struggles that she went through getting through the C-suite as she climbed to be CEO of IHOP, because she wants to help other people. So guests that are interested in sharing their story after the Flip Your Script, because in the middle of it, it's painful, it's difficult. But once you're through that, and best-selling authors, nationally known artists, they want to tell their story because they really want to help someone else, because if any of us can help someone else and make their journey a little less painful, I feel like that's what we're here to do.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, I've been, over the last few months, being more open about like anxiety and depression and those kinds of mental health things. And it's crazy when you just share that you have it. I've had people come up to me, like even yesterday, someone was like, I didn't know that you were going through that. And I've been going through it too. Like, let's work through things together. And having that like open dialogue is a lot more helpful than I think people might give it credit for.
And I wanted to start a podcast for years because I love the platform so much, but I couldn't figure out what? Like, why? Why should we do this? It takes a lot of time and energy and money, so why do it? And I went through a process of figuring out my personal story. I was a television reporter for 12 years, and I was laid off with 20 other people, and my business started after that. So whenever I tell that story, and I do quite a bit of speaking and talk about that story because I hope to help other people with the story, people always say how it inspires them, which is fascinating to me because it's like, really? This is my normal, I lived this. My lived experience is motivating to you. So in that nugget is where the podcast was born. So the Flip Your Script concept is from my own personal experience, which I'm very open about because it does help other people, and it's very humbling.
I love it. For going forward here, if anybody wants to jump in too, feel free if you want to tag on. Justin, I wanted to ask you, one thing that is the not so sexy side of podcasting is finding guests and planning the show and making audiograms and doing all of that fun stuff. How do you get started with planning content and guests and planning a release schedule?
Yeah. Well, I think the more you can automate, the better, right? So, if you can find, I typically go out to these sites like Fiverr, Upwork, stuff like that, and try and find people to sort of help you. Not either scan the internet to try and find guests, but also help you with some of the mixing and some of those things. Some of the editing definitely helps. And I guess, when I started the podcast, it was around the same time that you did as well. The pandemic had hit. My company I decided to start an initiative called 30 Days of Learning. And I let every employee do whatever they wanted for 30 days. I didn't care what you did. One of our employees learned how to bake bread, right? But the whole initiative behind it was learn something for these next 30 days because we didn't have a whole lot of work going on, guys. But things are going to start turning around. So I chose podcasting as my thing. And it's been sitting there in the back of my mind for 2 years. I should start this podcast. And what I did is I just went ahead and started it, right? It was start with your network of who you know. Just go on LinkedIn and who are you first round connected with? And just reach out to them. Start small. That's all you really need to do is just start getting 1 or 2 guests. I also think that there's this feeling like, I got to publish every week, right? And I think, Tim and I have talked about this, I think you need to have a good schedule of how often you do it and stick to that. But it does not need to match the Joe Rogan level or whatever we're talking about here with some of these people that are just whipping them out pretty much every other day or so, right? So I think you just need to be realistic about what you can do in your time frame. I think you just need to start, and then I also think that there's a lot of stuff that you can do. I think you should focus on your network, focus on putting together your questions. Listen to other podcasts is what I was going to say too as well. Think about podcasts and other people. What's their interview style, and what can you learn from them? What are some interesting questions that they're asking that you could fold into how you approach the situation? And then try and automate, try and use some of these other sites just to sort of get some of the mundane work sort of, out of the way. Obviously, you're going to have to do a fair amount of it to begin with, but if you can find some low-cost services like that will really sort of help you multiply your effort.
Are there any specific parts of that you would say are better to automate than others, like having an editor that you can throw files to and let them handle it, or a producer to go and schedule guests and coordinate schedules and stuff?
Yeah, I think for me, I spent a lot of time going through and editing episodes, to be honest, to begin with. And what I realized was that's something I could definitely just throw a file off to somebody. If you go on Fiverr, they'll do it for you. And my time is much better spent doing some of these other things about figuring out who I'm going to interview, reaching out to them, and sort of bringing them in. So I think some of those tasks, I think you should consider. Again, everyone's got their own perspective. I have a friend who does a podcast that spends hours meticulously editing pretty much every second of the thing. And I'm like, well, that's cool, but I would rather spend my time over here. So I would suggest that you think about pieces like that. But at the end of the day, I have had people that I've tried to hire to reach out and try and bring in guests, but at the end of the day, it's going to be you talking to them. So you kind of have to still need to build that one-on-one relationship.
Yeah. Allie, I'm curious from your standpoint, how do you judge success for your show? Ratings, reviews, shares, leads, what kind of metrics do you use to determine, yes, this was a great episode or not?
All of the above, and I would love to hear from the others. I think one of the biggest frustrations, because podcasting is still relatively young and new, it's hard to get really great analytics. Even, we use SoundCloud, we use a couple other, it's just, I'm like, really? This is it? We have a premium account. So we track everything, obviously. We've been experimenting just recently, actually, with some sponsored posts on social media. The engagement's been really high, so that's great. But and I think back to what everybody else was saying, a lot of it is anecdotal at this point. I'm getting pitched by, obviously I receive hundreds of pitches every week. We're a news organization, but increasingly people are pitching the podcast. They don't want to be in the magazine, they want to be on the podcast, and that's kind of mind-blowing, a little scary, because we do need to keep the print thing going too, but it just tells me how, first of all, I think, where do you get that kind of opportunity to have an hour of time to just tell your story unfiltered, direct to an audience? So I think it's very appealing appealing to a lot of people. People do want to tell their stories. They like to talk, and publicists are recognizing that too. So I think it's that feedback and just, all of the engagement we're seeing. And then frankly, at the end of the day, advertisers. We're a media company. We are in business to, we sell ads in print, we sell sponsorships at events, and we're starting to sell ads on the podcast. And so if people want to spend money to be there because they know we've got an audience that's engaged, that's a really good sign. That's what we're going for.
The last part you said about selling ads on podcasts, I think is one that might be worth digging into a little bit too, because I know there's all kinds of things out there for getting ads on your podcast. You can go to podcast networks. You can go directly to different people. How do you at Twin Cities Business go about finding sponsors for specifically the podcast?
So for us, at least for now, we're approaching it, we have a sales team that's selling ads for our other products, and we're approaching it the same way. And so far, it's been packages. They're a little reluctant to do one-offs. I'm like, if somebody wants to advertise, let them advertise. But, that's why they don't let me do the money stuff. So I just keep churning out the content. But, they're trying to sell packages and sponsorships, and a lot of times it goes with a digital package. So they've got banner ads on the website. They've got audio ads on the podcast. Maybe there's a print too, and that really tends to be a better use of our time. So that's how we're approaching it right now.
Right on. That makes sense. Anna, I'm wondering from your standpoint, what connections have you personally made from doing the show that have really impacted your career as a result of doing just the podcast?
I guess I would say the biggest thing that I've learned is that as technologists, we all have come from different places. And you don't have to have a fancy degree. You don't have to have gone even to college for, with a computer engineering degree to get into it. That there are a variety of ways in. There are a variety of ways that you can find your spot in it, and you don't have to be a coder. And also, by the way, one of the things that I've learned, because this has come up over and over and over again, imposter syndrome is sort of the buzzword that gets thrown around, especially with underrepresented groups, and I hate it. But we're all a little bit scared at times, and we all feel like, how did we get here? And I think it was Ann Steiner in our first season who said, I was asked to take on a VP role when David Hussman was actively dying, actually, and looking for somebody to be his successor and to take over to Dev Jam. He asked Ann Steiner, and Ann said, I don't know that I'm ready. And he said, you're ready because I'm telling you that you're ready. So you should listen to me. And she said, I've thought about that, and that's come up again and again with our different guests. If somebody else thinks that you're ready and has said, you should apply for this job, you should do this thing, you're ready for this, and you don't feel ready, you should listen to that other person. And if you're a little bit scared, just jump in and do it. And that's something that, I've heard it from all of these fabulous guests who are smarter than me, and I feel like, but I can take that, and I've been using that then in how I'm thinking about the podcast, how I'm thinking about, navigating my own spaces in corporate America at Best Buy. I just applied for a new role that I wasn't sure I felt ready for, but I thought, I'm a little bit scared. Somebody else says I'm ready, I should do it. And so I did.
That's a really good question to ask the whole panel. If anybody else has any thoughts around imposter syndrome as it relates to podcasting, because I certainly have felt it doing it myself. It's like, who am I to ask so-and-so to be on my show, and who's going to ever listen to my thing? I think I go through that. Even still, we're almost 100 episodes in, and I still feel that sometimes. Does anybody else have any experiences around imposter syndrome with podcasting?
Every time when we do ours Zoom, shout out to Studio Americana for making us sound good. So we do it on Zoom, but it's primarily audio when we put it out, of course, podcast. There are guests where I get on and I'm like, are they going to show up? Because are they really going to? And then they show up, and then I have to kind of keep my cool. I'm a big Billy Joel fan, and we got the piano player and a backup singer who tours with Billy Joel, and I had everything I could do to keep it together, because he's singing and he's playing the piano, and he told his story, which is so powerful. And there are times where I think I'm not worthy. So yes, for me, absolutely.
I think for me, it's been a little bit of a learning curve. I'm not really the person typically to be a reporter or to be out there asking questions. So I see people on TV and I'm like, I don't know how they do that. That's amazing. But I have learned over time that just to go back and listen to your episodes, I cringe a lot of times at the beginning. Like, I don't want to listen to myself. But I did listen to one recently, and I was like, I did pretty good there, right? I mean, I started feeling like I asked good questions. I came across as intelligent. This actually worked out really well. And so I think, you got to start somewhere, and there's going to be a little bit of fear involved. But I think at some point you start to turn the corner, and you'll start to feel like, yeah, I can do this.
And even if you can't be the next Terry Gross of Twin Cities podcasting, because she's sort of my hero, is I want to be the next Terry Gross. I'm never going to get there. But if I lead with curiosity and enthusiasm for the topic, that can get me over a lot. And, people are going to give me stumbles or not saying something right if I'm enthusiastic and I'm curious.
I agree.
No, I was just going to say, we started out recording at the University of St. Thomas in their podcast studio. They're a presenting sponsor of By All Means, and they had a podcast studio that wasn't being used, and that was kind of how it came together, and so we were using their space. And then the pandemic happened, campus shut down. Meanwhile, they actually tore the building down where the studio was, so we're out of there. Our sound engineer has his own studio in White Bear Lake, which has been great, and we've moved there, and for a while guests were remote, and now we're kind of at a place where, guests could come, and it's actually kind of nice, but it's in White Bear Lake. Who's going to drive to White Bear Lake? And the first few that I asked, I'm like, oh my gosh, I know you're so busy, you're so important, you can zoom in, and they're like, no, I'll come. And I was like, really? But I think, first of all, it speaks to the fact that a lot of people just want to get out of their houses right now, and they're excited. But it does. I mean, I think we all have those moments where you can't believe, like, oh, I'm not worthy. But people want to come. They want to do it. They want to engage, and they want to have that face-to-face conversation if they are given the opportunity, even if it's in White Bear Lake.
Especially if it's in White Bear Lake. Mike, question for you. Podcasting, I think, as we all know, can really be a great tool for lead generation. So I'm wondering how podcasting has helped you with your sales funnel.
Yeah, it's been really great. In the beginning, it was our primary marketing form. We still, to this day, we haven't run any ads for our job board or recruiting services. Everything's been organic. The one time we ever ran ads was for our summit back in June. We did that on LinkedIn, but other than that, all of our growth has been organic, all of the accolades. In our first year in business, we've won 4 awards. We've grown our community to over 4,000 members. Our summit had attendance from 10 different countries. And so all that kicked off with the podcast. And what it is, we, even to this day, there are a lot of people that are like, are there black people in technology? And then it's like, well, there may be some, but how many? Is there enough to actually do what it is you're trying to do? And this comes up when I'm talking to corporations in a sales meeting. This comes up when I'm pitching in pitch competitions where they're like, love you, love your idea, love your early traction, but we just don't think there's enough people for you to actually do what you say you're gonna do. So not only am I fighting for my people, I'm fighting for us as well, to kind of get over those biases and barriers. And so with the podcast, I'm able to show them that there are these people at these major companies and they're doing their thing, and then they can go in the comments and see other people in the community participating and asking questions or networking of things of that nature. And that makes them trust the process and what we're doing and the mission more, which then leads to ourselves, right? Leads to them reaching out and wanting to have that one-on-one meeting to truly understand what we do and how they can help and how they can get involved. And then that leads to participating in the job board or a sponsorship or hiring us for our recruiting services. So it's been real effective in the beginning, and now it helped us get over that hump, and the summit helped us get over the hump again, because now they were able to see en masse a lot of people applying for jobs. They were able to see all black panelists speaking on diversity and inclusion, black employee retention. Brown Ventures participated and spoke on the benefits of investing in BIPOC founders. So it's been a great tool.
Podcasting, it really, speaking from someone that consumes a lot of podcasts, it's you really feel like you develop a relationship with the host, and it's like you've got them directly in your ears, and you kind of have to paint the world in your head, so you develop this really close relationship with hosts, and I think that kind of speaks to why it works so well as a sales tool and as a lead generator, is because if you can get good content and tell good stories and establish good relationships, people want to come back and work with you because they feel like they know you.
Definitely. And I was telling my team early on, for anybody who's ever seen my podcast or had a Zoom meeting with me, I sit on the throne. And that started out with, I had a photography studio and we did multimedia and stuff in there, and during the pandemic I had to shut it down. If you remember, in the beginning of the pandemic, people couldn't even go into their own offices and conduct business, right? And so I had bought it for that intention, and it was sitting in the corner of my home office, and I got booked to speak to, I think it was the youth of Genesis Works. And so I'm like, oh, they'll think this is cool. Let me throw this throne in there. And then right after, I had like 3 or 4 meetings, and I didn't feel like moving it, so I just kept having these meetings with this throne, and it was like an instant icebreaker for everybody. And so after a while, I was telling my team, I'm like, because we put out so much content from our podcast in video form, and people are seeing me in this throne, what happened is during the sales meetings, people were disappointed if I wasn't in the throne because they got so used to my podcast personality that they wanted that same experience, And so that's also been like a differentiator, or like something that's been interesting and kind of helped mingle the two, the sales side and lead generation, along with the kind of podcast personality side.
I love it. You got to give the people what they want.
Yeah.
I was just going to add, Mike, I learned about you from the Constant Variables podcast. You were actually on that episode and on his show. And you talk about creating a personal thing. Like I was running down the Mississippi River Boulevard listening to you talk about your story at 5:30 in the morning. And I remember that moment. And I would have not learned about your organization, would not learn about you if I hadn't been listening to your podcast. So it's nice how all of this stuff sort of interleaves and sort of like overlaps.
I don't have any cash on me, but I'll pay you after the show for that. That was great. Kristi, I think one question I want to ask you, since you do a lot of storytelling as part of your role, I think people don't really fully appreciate the power of storytelling within sales. So how is a business's story relevant to connecting with customers, and how is podcasting a good avenue for telling that story?
It's nice to hear that publicists and people are figuring that out, because storytelling is the key. It's how we connect. And a business can go out with beautiful data, beautiful pie charts, beautiful stats. It's very different from hearing the founder's story. You can connect with the person, you can connect with the story. You can't connect with a spreadsheet. And every spreadsheet, and every financial person will say, a spreadsheet tells a story. And people are looking at a spreadsheet and they're looking at numbers for stories. So when I think about stories, and I did it as a TV reporter, I'm a journalist, I just believe so deeply in stories. And the company, Media Minefield, is really different in how we approach people's stories, businesses' stories, because we're starting with the story. We're not starting with the data. We're not starting with the tagline. We're getting into that story. So the podcast really came from a place. I know that people have amazing stories, and I believe everyone that I meet could be on the Flip Your Script podcast, because everyone has this story of something happened to them, whether they intended for it to happen or it surprised them, and their life has to shift, and they make a constant decision how to turn the page. Now, not everyone wants to share their story, but as businesses share stories, it becomes, you remember them. I mean, you remember the names of stories, of companies that you've heard the story. It just resonates different, and there's all sorts of data that people are buying products when they know the story. When they've heard the story, it's very different than it was 10, 15 years ago, because we didn't have these platforms. What's been surprising to me, I knew that when we put this out there, it was a sell to my executive team, because I don't have a path from the podcast to ROI. I've got a path to spending a lot of money on the podcast and spending a lot of time doing it. I don't have a direct path to ROI, but I knew that if we can share stories and continue to push the power of story, good things will happen, and we can impact other people. And what's surprised me is we've been growing extensively at the company, and every single person, I meet with every new employee for 30 minutes. Like, you're working at a founder company, so you need to know who I am and where we're going, and that's part of what you're doing. Every single person who we've hired since we started the podcast have said they've listened to the podcast and they wanted to know me before they would work at the company, which is fascinating. And I don't know why more companies aren't getting this. One woman told me she listened to 6 episodes before she'd even apply. It's just so important for people to know who they're working for and what that person stands for. And in the podcast, I'm out there.
Yeah, I could not agree more. It's it's really interesting with storytelling. Like you have to, the more personal connections that you can put out there when you're selling, everything with sales is personal. And if you can establish that personal relationship through a podcast, I can't get over it. I was stunned when you said that someone had listened to 6 episodes before applying for a job. Like that's such a cool testament to the power of podcasting, where, like you said, you can't necessarily have a direct path to ROI. It's all kind of ancillary things. And when we're in a world where everything is driven by metrics and numbers and data, there's still room for some kind of more soft, feeling of we're going in the right direction.
And we're hiring storytellers. So I guess it's not surprising to me that these people care about the story of the company they're walking into. And we've had clients say they're picking between a couple of agencies, and just the fact that we have a podcast tells them that we believe in storytelling. And that's the future of business, is in the story.
Absolutely. I want to make sure I'm mindful of time. I should have written down what time I'm supposed to be. What time is it done at? I know it's 11:10, but what time is it done? 25. Awesome. 15 minutes. Perfect. I wanted to open up the floor if there's anybody here that might have a question for the panel and wants to ask of it. We'll be grabbing a mic and pass it around. I still have more questions that I can ask as well, but just in case anybody wanted to ask one, go ahead and raise your hand and we'll get a mic over to you.
Hi, I have a question actually from our virtual audience. Let's see, should have been more prepared. Charles says, I currently edit 4 podcasts that I write and would much rather make more content than spend all that time editing. Do you have any recommendations for places that might be able to cut the podcasts?
I'll give a shout out right away to Studio Americana, who is, I think they're on your next half. Ian has been fantastic to work with at Studio Americana. He's really made us sound a lot more polished than when we were doing our editing on our own. Jess was doing our editing and she was fantastic, but being able to pay somebody else to make us sound good is aces.
What she said.
I was going to say the same. We almost went that route, and then this whole thing worked out with the University of St. Thomas. At the risk of revealing my secret weapon, I would say Tom Forliddy, who is an independent audio guy. Anybody who's worked in sound and audio visuals in this town in the last number of years knows him. He's actually a freelancer who was hired. We met him through St. Thomas. He works on his own. He's now doing several podcasts as a result of By All Means, and he's fantastic too.
Mike, who do you have edit your show?
Yeah, we do all of our stuff in-house. So my creative director does the editing, and we keep it pretty simple. We've already have our intro, outro pre-done. We use the same music on every episode, and then he just goes in and makes the tweaks on the audio, and then we create 5 to 10 mini clips from our hour-long sessions. So I'll go in, which takes time because now I got to watch it again. And so I'll go in and pick what sound bites we want, send him over the timestamps, and then he'll chop it up. So we do it ourselves, but we have a process to it and it doesn't take too long.
Justin, how about you?
Yeah, as I alluded to before, I use some of these online platforms like Fiverr, Upwork, to do the actual audio editing. I do have a person, she's our digital marketing person, and she's been using Headliner to do some of these clips and some videos. We also have now recently started putting it on YouTube as well, so just converting it to MP4 and then pushing it up there. Remains to be seen if that's worth it or not with regards to that medium. But yeah, like I say, I think you can, again, if you find somebody good online, however you end up, hooking up with them, whether they're local or not, stick with them, because they'll understand, I think, how your episodes are being run, what type of questions you're going to be asking, and then like Mike was saying, like we have the same audio in the same extra, outro, whatever you want to call it. So it's more or less like 3 or 4 files that need to be stitched together. The work really comes in with regards to removing the ums and ahs and the weird pauses, which is usually me, not the guest. And then of course doing some equalization and putting a little bit of reverb in. But you can find places and then just send them a file and see what they do. You can't always change. Like I say, if you find somebody good, stick with them. But also feel like, yeah, I'm not stuck with this person. Let me try something else over here as well.
One thing
I will say,
go ahead.
We use Buzzsprout for distribution. So you can make an account on there, and then it'll distribute it to Apple Podcasts and iHeart, et cetera, et cetera. they do have some basic tools on there. Like I said, we do our stuff on our own, but for anybody who's looking to jump into it, they have some basic audio enhancement tools, and they also have a kind of like a soundbite tool where you can make a soundbite and they'll give it to you so you can distribute it on Instagram and stuff like that.
One thing I'll throw out is we have, I used to edit our show by myself, and that was not a fun use of time. So I ended up just looking through my network, and I had a friend who was graduating with a degree in audio engineering, and I just reached out and said, hey, do you want to do it freelance? And he said yes. So if you have friends that are recording people or have that experience, tap your networks. I think it's not super expensive to hire someone to do edit your podcast, and it's nice to have a second set of ears, because what you might sit and nitpick and get every single little and ah out of there, that can actually make you sound a lot more robotic. So having an experienced person that knows how to make people sound natural without having them sound rambly like I do is really nice to have that second set of person doing that. So, got a couple questions up here.
Hi, so on a sales side, you're always looking for like your ideal customer. I'm wondering how you all have found your ideal speaker. So in the start, kind of, how did you think about who those speakers were, and how did that evolve in figuring out who your best speakers were to come on your show?
In terms of guests, you mean?
Yeah. Yes.
I mean, for us, everybody has a good story, but there are some that are really, really compelling. We look for, maybe it's a company that you know, it's, Evereve, it's Caribou Coffee, brands that you might not know the name of the founder, but you're gonna kind of want to know their story, so we go that way. And sometimes it's someone who I know is just really dynamic and inspiring. I think it can work either way, but somebody who's really willing to share a story, and the more open and articulate, the better.
I look for stories, and we have producers and people helping that work at Media Minefield, and I read stories, and I am like a dreamer, and I don't believe that people are going to tell us no. So it's something I read in the New York Times, an artist I like, a book that I loved, and we just reach out and ask. And it's sort of shocking. We get a lot of yeses. I mean, Dolly Parton told us no, but her people responded. So we just ask.
Yeah, for me, our guests, what's important is the impact of representation. And so, like, my first guest was from Google, my second guest was from Microsoft. And so I started off with my network, people that I had seen. Like I said, I source a lot of people from LinkedIn. And one thing you can do as well, I don't do it with the Black Tech Talent podcast, but with another podcast I have, I ask my guests at the end to nominate another guest. And that especially, for the way you all do your podcast, where you have high-profile people and celebrities and things of that nature, because if they had a good experience, now they're co-signing that experience with you, and then they can maybe get you to somebody you may not have gotten to on your own, or just introduce you to somebody you may not know. So that's another tactic that you can use, is when you get lucky with that first guest, just say, hey, we'd love for you to nominate the next guest, and that could work, and then now you've got a pipeline rolling of potential guests and a cosign for what you're doing.
One thing, Anna, you said before was following your curiosity. And I think as a podcast host, most often Jenny, who works at our company, is the one who picks out these guests, and she does an amazing job. I have no idea what her secret is, and I don't know if I want to throw a mic in her face to give it away. But I think following your curiosity, for me, there have been a few guests that I just was like, I don't know how this is going to relate to the podcast, but I'm really interested in this person, so I'm going to reach out and see if they're interested. And that has been something that's worked really well. Like those guests tend to be, if I'm interested in it, typically your audience is interested in something ancillary to that as well. So it's like just following your curiosity, picking somebody that you might be interested in is probably going to be somebody that other people are interested in as well.
Great. We have one more question online. And the question is, would the panel recommend entrepreneurs to start their own podcast or try and be a guest on different podcasts?
I would recommend both. As he mentioned earlier, he discovered me through his podcast. I have my own podcast, so it allows you to bring different audiences together because you have your audience that you go for, they have their audience, and sometimes that intersects, and it helps to network. And as we're talking about on this panel specifically, sales, marketing, lead generation. I would also say that there's different ways to approach podcasting, right? It can be a passion and it's just something you want to do, or it can be in a sense of content creation, right? So I enjoy talking, having great conversations, and I would do it for years, and everybody would be like, we should have recorded that. So part of me is natural when it comes to kind of what we do. But then I was like, well, let's add the value and share this information with other people. And so we were able to utilize it for content as well, so that we could consistently put out stuff at 10 mini clips per episode. That's 2 weeks worth of posts pushing one episode. And we do, at first we started off with an episode a week, and now we're scaling that down to 2 episodes a month, just because of the production time and how busy we've gotten over this first year. But I would suggest definitely doing both if it's a passion, and just don't overthink it. If it's a passion, do it as a passion. Don't worry about sponsorship. Don't worry about views and listens. Just get good at your craft and do things you want to do. And if it's more of a business strategy, then look at it as content. And what type of content would your audience like to see from you?
I think the operative word there, though, is passion. I mean, I think for the entrepreneur who is maybe just dabbling, you might be wise to go be a guest a couple times. There are lots of places and lots of people who want to talk to you, and it's a good way to dip your toe in and then say, wow, I really love this medium. I'd love to do more of it. But once you start your own, as everybody up here can attest, it is definitely another work stream that you've got to continue feeding.
And I think it's really important to know what your purpose is with your own podcast and what you want to talk about, because there's a lot of podcasts that you can talk about, but you can get really off message. I've been trying to get on Allie's podcast for a long time, so I'm hoping that this is eventually going to work. But I mean, because you need to know what podcast resonates with who you are and what your story is, and likewise. So we get guests that get pitched to us, and we say no thank you, not because they're not compelling, it just doesn't fit. So I think that's for an entrepreneur as well. Don't just start a podcast to start a podcast. Understand specifically what you're trying to do and what kind of stories you want out there.
Do you have any thoughts, Anna?
I was just going to add, and do a little bit of research too with that. It starts with your own curiosity and what you're interested in, but check to see if somebody else is already doing what you're doing. When we started Women in Tech Twin Cities, we looked out there, and yeah, there are a lot of other women in tech podcasts out there, but they're frankly mostly talking about what's happening on the coasts. So being able to hone in then further and say, okay, we're going to talk about what's happening here in the Twin Cities. That's what our hook is and what makes us different, and what allows us to say, yeah, we're going to do this on top of our day jobs, because it is another job on top of your day jobs, which is part of why we've slowed down how many episodes we're putting out there. We were pretty aggressive to start, and then we said, oh wait, we have families. Maybe we should talk to our families and not just to these people that we want on our podcast. So know that going in, if you're doing this as an entrepreneur, that you'll be doing this as another part-time job on top of your entrepreneurship.
Yeah, no, I think those are all great answers. What came to mind was what you just said with regards to how to differentiate yourselves, right? And so for us, artificial intelligence can be a broad term. It can be used everywhere. But really what I like to focus on is applying, right? So again, back to the story about how are you applying this technology. We don't talk about technology for the sake of technology. We're like, how are you using this industry in your industry specifically, and how can it change people's lives, right? So that is what I looked at when I looked at the landscape. I didn't see enough of that going on. And what happens, I don't even know how many podcasts there are. There's got to be 100,000 podcasts out there. So the moment you launch that, you've got 0 people listening. And so the more opportunity you have to get on somebody else's, who even has 1 or 2, take that opportunity to begin with, right? So I would say, like Mike was saying, do a little bit of both. I would highly encourage that, because when you get started, it's going to be a little bit lonely out there. You're not going to turn on, basically your stats, and all of a sudden you see hundreds of people downloading it. It takes time to finally get the machine going and get it going. So you can help yourself by getting on and plugging yourself into some of these other networks.
Well, I appreciate all 5 of you taking time to share your hard-fought knowledge and well-earned knowledge, and I think we should all give these panelists a hand and say thank you for coming and joining us today.
at Brevity, we actually are starting our own podcast called How I Pitch This. So this was a very timely discussion. And I think one of the key things that I took away from it is having a clear understanding of your goal and purpose of the podcast, whether that's passion related, and if it's business related, making sure that you're keeping in account what your audience cares about, making sure you're getting some really good feedback there. One of the things I love, I forgot who said it, but I don't believe in people telling us no. I think that's right on par. And then in terms of how to acquire guests, the purpose of our podcast for How I Pitch This is really to interview entrepreneurs that have been on Shark Tank. So we've recorded, whether it's Shark Tank, whether it's a startup demo day or an accelerator, we interview entrepreneurs to really talk about the early stages of their journey, but then we also get into the nuts and bolts of how they prepared a pitch that got funded from Kevin O'Leary or got funded from Barbara. And then what was really interesting about it, once we got our first 2 guests, and I shot them the recording of the video edit and a key takeaway article, it was a lot easier to build. And they know other Shark Tank winners. There's a lot of other Shark Tank communities, so they were able to refer us to 5 guests. So that'll be coming out in 2022. And Mike, I actually learned this from Mike. The beauty of the podcast is the wealth of content that it can create. I think Gary Vee says it best: document, don't create. So I think that's also another benefit of using podcasting as a marketing tool.